Salutations, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland, carrying on my series about the Northern Ireland Troubles. So I got to 1984 and the IRA bombed the Conservative Conference, that Grand Hotel in Brighton. Patrick McGee had booked a room there some weeks before. He'd figured out where the Prime Minister was most likely to have a room, and he'd done a bit of DIY and hidden a bomb near where he presumed her room would be, and he'd guessed correctly. Anyway, McGee was caught. The IRA toyed with the notion of assassinating other members of the House of Windsor. They particularly had it in for Prince Charles because the Prince of Wales was Colonel-in-Chief of the Parachute Regiment. Republicans called him the Para Prince, and the Paras were particularly detested by Republicans because they'd killed 14 people in Derry back in 1972. Sean O'Callaghan maintains that the IRA wanted to kill Prince Charles and Princess Diana at the Dominion Theatre by putting a bomb in the theatre, but that didn't happen. O'Callaghan may not be entirely trustworthy. Another thing is the IRA perhaps wary of escalating the conflict too much, because then the government might bring in some very extensive security legislation, compulsory ID cards, mass fingerprinting, a security fence between the Republic of Ireland and the UK, which would make the IRA's campaign more difficult. So the IRA and INLA were finding it increasingly tricky to attack hard targets, police stations, barracks, members of the security forces on duty. So they were invariably killing them off duty, usually when they were unarmed. They had absolutely no compunction about killing unarmed people. Or, for example, as a UDR man who's also works at a dog's home and calling him out on a bogus call to collect a dog and trying to kill him like that, and so on. But the young man from Sligo who tried to kill this UDR soldier was himself shot dead in the attempt. The IRA and INLA had some people killed by loyalist terrorists. The loyalist terrorists were not very active by the early 80s. So the UVF would claim to be an army and that they were heavily armed and utterly dedicated, and they would kill about 3 people a year, usually unarmed Catholics who were not part of the Republican movement. As I said, some rogue members of the security forces did assist loyalist terrorists in the early 80s, not as much as had been done beforehand. The security forces also followed Republicans into the Republic of Ireland, maintaining surveillance on them there. And as one soldier said that he'd been spying on Slab Murphy, who was an IRA head honcho in South Armagh, who had a farm that spanned the border, who exploited EEC subsidies as to the max by bringing his sheep back across the border and collecting a subvention every time. And he could easily have been killed by a sniper or something like that, but that never happened. Let me see. Some members of the security forces would justify what they were doing, assisting the loyalist terrorists, saying UVF and UDA are going to exist anyway. We don't want them to kill innocent Catholics. We want them to kill members of the IRA and INLA. This is proactive self-defense. It was still illegal. In the early 80s, the Crown Forces had a new idea, the Supergrass system. They got some loyalist and Republican criminals to turn Queen's evidence, to tell everything and prosecute people on that basis. Anyway, quite a few Republican and loyalist terrorists were imprisoned for up to a year whilst on remand, put on trial. But the whole Supergrass thing collapsed when judges found that the evidence was unreliable. So the courts demanded a very high standard of evidence. So of all the tens of thousands of people convicted in relation to the Troubles, very, very few were wrongfully convicted. People know about the case of the Birmingham 6 or the Guildford 4, people whose convictions were found to be unsafe, but that was extremely unusual. Even those who were acquitted would often go on to say, yeah, sure, I did it. But just that the courts demanded proof positive. So by the 80s, almost a generation had grown up with the Troubles being the norm. People were a bit desensitized to violence, and a second generation of people were coming through following their fathers, and in some cases their mothers, into paramilitary organizations. And communal relations were bad. Northern Ireland was polarized because people went to different schools according to their religious denomination in most cases, socialized in different pubs, often members of different sports clubs, might work in an organization which was overwhelmingly of one denomination or other. So it was more divided than it had been in the 60s, precisely because of the Troubles. The GAA, Gaelic Athletic Association, well, it was there for Gaelic football and hurling. But as well as the sports, it was promoting Irish identity, but a particularly nationalist expression thereof, the Irish language, Irish dancing, Members of the security forces or pensioners therefrom were not permitted to join it. The GAA often named its clubs after former IRA men, or notably, they got a stadium in Belfast, Casement Park, after Sir Roger Casement, who was executed for high treason in 1916, trying to bring German soldiers into Ireland. Unionist councils often refused to let public pitches be used by the GAA. Now, some people in the GAA just because they like sport and socialising, but there was a Republican tinge to it. Not everyone in the GAA was an IRA supporter, but more than a few were. So there were fiefdoms within Northern Ireland controlled by loyalist terrorists or their Republican counterparts. Drug abuse had become a significant problem, and loyalists and Republicans were dealing drugs, but also killing rival drug dealers. Cigarette smuggling, that was a good money spinner. Petrol smuggling, because of the tax differential between the Republic of Ireland and the UK. Kidnappings as well. Robberies, not so much as before. Let me see what else. Protection rackets, illegal taxis, especially on the Falls Road. Rory O'Broader was leader of Sinn Fein, one-time IRA chief of staff in the early 60s. He stood down and Adams took over as a leader of the Sinn Fein party. The party was to be largely his fan club. Well, for the next 34 years, he's only just now stepping aside. His father had been in prison for the attempted murder of an RUC officer, and his father had been released after only about 4 years in prison, which just shows how incredibly lenient and compassionate the UK is. Of course, his father wasn't one bit grateful for having been let off. He could easily have been executed for what he did. It was 1942. In most countries, people were executed for far less. But the UK is one of the most humane countries in the world, which is why his treatment was just so soft. By the way, Gerry Adams' father, Gerry Adams Sr., sexually abused many of his children. Some people think that the security forces realised this was a recruitable weakness in the Adams family, and that perhaps Gerry Adams was a spy for the Crown all along because he'd been blackmailed about his curious version of family values. Anyway, about this time, Adams began a civil case in Belfast High Court. He said that the UK had no legitimacy in Northern Ireland, yet there he was using its legal system. He said it was unjust, but he was using a system of justice. So yet again, it was nauseatingly hypocritical and proving how justice was completely even-handed. Even somebody who was an outspoken advocate of terrorism could expect fair treatment in the legal system. So there he was getting his fair hearing. But as he was coming back to his house one day, some members of the UDA tried to shoot him. Well, they did shoot him, but not fatally. They were arrested by Ulster Defence Regiment soldiers at the scene. The UVF had been planning an attack on him about the same time. The UVF and UDA said, we've got to put our heads together because we're almost accidentally thwarting each other. So these loyalist terrorists began to cooperate a little bit. Other notable events. Lord Gibson, who was a judge from Northern Ireland, went to the Republic and he was assassinated by the IRA. He was a Catholic judge, by the way. So it's an example of Republican hypocrisy, complaining there weren't enough Catholics in the judiciary and then killing them if they were in the judiciary, complaining if they joined. There are not enough Catholics in the RUC, but if they join, that's an absolutely outrageous act of treason. But it wasn't such an act of treason for Protestants to join. It showed their sectarian attitude, complaining about a problem which they had deliberately created. Anyway, the Libyan Connection. The IRA formed a very cordial relationship with Muammar al-Gaddafi, the brotherly guide of the revolution in Libya. He was also totally anti-American, something they didn't boast about when they were speaking to their American friends. So his agents had bombed US troops in West Germany. So Thatcher gave permission for American warplanes to take off from the UK and bomb Libya. So Gaddafi was furious about this, and then he started supplying large amounts of arms to the IRA in the mid-80s. At that point, the IRA campaign had been running out of steam. They hadn't as many weapons as they had before. The Irish Navy had successfully intercepted the Mara to Anne, a major shipment of illegal weapons from the United States, where Martin Ferris, a Kerry Republican, was caught and given 10 years in prison. So the IRA had a new lease of life because of weapons that were shipped from Libya. Of course, in Libya, peaceful dissidents were treated more harshly than the IRA could possibly imagine, but it didn't stop them praising Gaddafi to the moon. Thatcher was worried about the rise of Sinn Fein in the early 1980s because Sinn Fein was taking electoral politics somewhat seriously. They get elected to local councils. By 1995, the SDLP realised Sinn Féin were not as serious a threat as they'd first represented, but they were aware this was quite a good negotiating position in order to extract concessions from Thatcher. So the UK and Irish government began having secret negotiations, keeping the SDLP fully briefed, and this was to lead to the Hillsborough Castle Agreement, or Anglo-Irish Agreement, as it's commonly called. But I'll cover that one next time.